much, Manuel. I'd just like to say thanks on behalf of the IAB for all the work that has been put in by many, many people to organize this event. I know there will be some people that will be looking forward to sleeping very well at the end of the week. This session is an academic crossover session between the International Association of Bioethics Congress, so it's the first session, but it's also the last session of the conference that there's been for the last 2 days here with the feminist approaches to bioethics. So we've specially chosen a theme that we hope is relevant to all members of the IAB and also to FAB. The first talk today will be given by Ruth Macklin, and she is a professor at the Albert Einstein University in New York, and she is one of the most prestigious people, I think, in bioethics. Her name and her work will be known to, I think, virtually everybody in this room. She's somebody who hasn't just done bioethics in an academic sense, but is very much committed to working particularly in the Latin American region for developing bioethics through an NIH grant, working with Florencia Luna. And she's also somebody, I think, who's taken an admirable role in working with organizations like WHO for many, many years. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Ruth Macklin to give today's lecture. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Angus, y hola a todos. The subtitle here, A Worldwide Culture of Sexual Violence Against Women, is the theme of this presentation. Respect for culture. We're told that we must have respect for culture, but how far should respect for culture take us when a culture fails to respect the human rights of women? And now I'm going to describe what is known in the literature, largely feminist literature, but other literature, as a rape culture. And here are some of the elements of the culture of rape. Blaming the victim, that is to say the woman wears provocative clothing, she asked for it. Trivializing sexual assault, the phrase, boys will be boys. Tolerance of sexual harassment, particularly in the workplace. Gratuitous gendered violence in movies and on TV. Defining manhood as dominant and sexually aggressive, and in contrast, defining womanhood as submissive and sexually passive. Pressure on men to score, I wouldn't know how to translate that into Spanish. Refusing to take rape accusations seriously, and publicly scrutinizing a victim's dress, her motives, and in particular, in court cases, her past history. So these are the elements that comprise the rape culture, as it's called, and then finally, jokes about rape. Here are some comments by prominent men, and I take these mostly out of newspaper accounts. The first was the former president of Pakistan, who was quoted in September 2005 in the newspaper in the United States, the Washington Post, who said, "A lot of people say, if you want to go abroad and get a visa for Canada or citizenship and be a millionaire, get yourself raped." The second comment is by a conservative columnist for the Washington Post, who recently as early this month, was talking about what he called the supposed epidemic of sexual assault on college campuses in the United States. He said, when universities make victimhood a coveted status that confers privileges, victims proliferate. So this was another way of almost blaming the victim. And then finally, the former chief minister of the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, who made this comment after a gang rape that occurred in India. Boys are boys, they make mistakes. So here are some statistics just to show you that this is a world crisis of rapes. From 1971 to 2012, the recorded cases of rape in India have gone from just under 2,500 to almost 25,000 annually over that 40-year period. Activists claim that only 10% of cases are reported to the police. South Africa, another state that has a very high incidence of rapes, one of the highest in the world. These are mostly estimates. Statistics are hard to obtain because most rapes are not reported, and this is actually true everywhere in the world, that there are fewer reported rapes than actually occur. One study estimates as high as 500,000 rapes over a 2-year period between 2011 and 2012. Well, there's a European group called the European Women's Lobby that tracks the number of rapes, the existing laws, and the responses in all of the EU countries. So if you want to write that down, anybody who's interested in looking at their account and the different countries, European countries, that's their work. Here is a sad tale of Olivia Zina, beautiful little girl in Liberia. Here's her story. When she was 7 years old, she was raped. When she was 9 years old, she was found to be severely malnourished and handicapped. The doctors determined that her condition was the result of a brutal rape that occurred when she was 7 years old. When she was confronted, the child named her 20-year-old cousin as the rapist, and here was the response. Olivia and her mother were shunned by their tribe. They lived in a rural area of Liberia. Because they sought outside help, they were shunned by their own tribe. And here's what she underwent at her ordeal. Her father left the household. We lost the slides. Her grandfather, who was a tribal chief, sided with the rapist. Many women in the community accepted the male culture that endorses this behavior. And one woman was quoted as saying, "Raping a child is considered a good luck move. They do it for a ritual purpose," the woman said. Now, the police actually arrested the rapist when he was identified, but then they released him, and there was nothing further about that case. This was all depicted in a documentary film, which I saw just last month in New York, called Small, Small Thing. In 2012, she died of septic shock related to her injuries. So they were never able, even though she had some good doctors in Monrovia, Liberia, they were never able to fix her after the brutal rape. So according to different accounts, some by human rights lawyers, the situation of rape in India is that the police are part of the problem. A human rights lawyer was quoted as saying, "If you're a woman in distress, the last thing you want to do is go to the police." This was quoting in the New York Times in January 2013. Another quotation from the same person, "Many women say the presence of the police makes them seem less safe, not more. In case after case, the police have used their powers to deliver women into the hands of their abusers." This was in the New York Times earlier this month. The article was written by an Indian woman on an editorial page, referring to what she called India's feudal rapists. The role of the caste system in India's rape crisis was part of what she was depicting. And here's what she said. A 12-year-old and a 14-year-old girl were raped and hung from a tree in the state of Uttar Pradesh earlier this month. The girls were of a lower caste than the group of brothers who raped them. Caste-based sexual violence and other forms of violence are actually condoned, culturally accepted in the community where this episode occurred. And when the father of the girls went to the police asked him what his caste was, and when they found out that he was among the lower castes, then they refused to act. However, India does have laws, and the problem in some places is not the absence of laws, but the absence of enforcement of the laws. So back in 1989, a law was passed called the Prevention of Atrocities Act, and that was designed to address caste-based violence in India. But apparently, it's hardly enforced, and the conviction rate is described as notoriously low. I have some pictures to show that there is now a movement, a public movement in India and elsewhere with people marching in the streets. Now, India actually has been responding to this, and this is part of the good news story. It's not all bad news. This was a former Chief Justice in India who was appointed to head a committee that was established to amend the then existing law in India in response to a brutal gang rape of a woman that took place on a bus. The woman subsequently died from her injuries. She was so severely injured. And the government in India appointed this Chief Justice to issue a report. Chapter 2 of that report is entitled Gender Justice and India's Obligations under International Conventions, and it cites several human rights declarations, human rights treaties, human rights conventions, and I'll say a little bit more about those later because it is widely believed or held that these are human rights violations. These are women marching in response to that very same rape that took place. Now we have another recent episode, widely reported in the newspapers. I'm not sure how many of you read these accounts in newspapers. They were certainly in major newspapers in the United States and the UK. A coalition of feminist groups documented more than 250 cases of mass sexual assault at public gatherings between November 2012 and January 2014. Human rights advocates blame Egypt's patriarchal culture for the frequency of attacks on women in public spaces. Most recently, again earlier this month, women were hospitalized after attacks during the presidential inaugural celebrations. Huge crowds were in the streets in Tahrir Square, and Human Rights Watch reported what they called an epidemic of sexual violence in Egypt. The Egyptian president, the newly elected president, later apologized to a victim who was publicly assaulted with her clothes torn off during a crowd that was celebrating his election. This is simply somebody took a photo of a little bit of sexual harassment in Egypt. Rape in Latin America. I'm sure this is not the case in all countries in Latin America. However, according to accounts that I've read, in 12 Latin American countries, a rapist can be exonerated, that is, can be not convicted and not even indicted, if he offers to marry the victim and she accepts. The family of the woman, of the women, frequently pressure her to marry the rapist, and this is said to restore the family's honor. And this is true in other cultures that are known as honor cultures. If the family is shamed, then the woman in other cultures outside of Latin America have to marry the very person who raped them. Now let me turn to the United States, lest you think that this is only in the countries that I've mentioned. According to the United States Department of Defense, reported sexual assaults in all branches of the United States Armed Forces rose 6% in 2012 to 3,374 cases. This is just in the military, not in civil society. Of those, several thousand, only 302 went to trial. leading to 238 convictions. So you can see small number of convictions. However, estimates from an anonymous survey, that is not people who came forward, indicate that in 2012 there were 26,000 sexual assaults in the United States military. The vast majority are not reported, which is why the anonymous study shows a much larger figure than the official statistics. Sexual assaults on campuses in universities in the United States. A government task force reported that 1 in 5 female students on college campuses were sexually assaulted. Only 12% of those are reported. Rapes have occurred at very prestigious universities such as Yale University and Dartmouth, the so-called 2 of the Ivy League schools. And there was a rape allegation at Florida State that was not investigated by the police. And it was believed that the reason the police did not act, because the university did not act to call in the police, the rapist was the accused person was a star football player. And the university itself, football this is American football, not what you call football here. It's American football, and just like the situation in any country that reveres its sports, the sports stars are idolized. Here's another, a different kind of sexual assault, and these occur, sorry about this, rape as a weapon of war and conflict. You must have heard of the situations in conflict situations in refugee camps and where there are internally displaced persons. These are conflicts, sexual assaults in conflict situations. And recently there has been a response. Again, these are positive developments that I'm about to describe briefly. The United Nations has a declaration of commitment to end sexual violence in conflict. There's the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague pledged to step up the court's investigation and prosecution of sexual and gender-based crimes. 2 weeks ago in London, there was a global summit to end sexual violence in conflict that took place. Representatives of more than 120 countries were present at that conference. There were more than 900 experts, NGOs, survivors, faith leaders, and international organizations. And what they did was develop an international protocol on the documentation and investigation of sexual violence in conflict. And what that document does is set standards for the collection of information. It urges countries to strengthen their domestic laws and allows for prosecutions both in and outside countries where sexual violence occurs. So there are a number of human rights provisions. I won't, my time is about up, and so I won't go into them in detail, but let me just mention where you can find these human rights statements. A rights-based approach in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That's one of the first major documents that came out from the United Nations treaties and covenants. The Women's Convention, known as the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. And there are provisions in these international documents not only for governments, that is the states that are the signatories to these declarations and conventions, but also for non-state actors. There are other international treaties in addition to these specific ones that are perhaps well known. There's one called the Istanbul Convention, specifically on preventing and combating violence against women and domestic violence. There's an Inter-American Convention on the prevention, punishment, and eradication of violence against women that was adopted back in 1994. So my conclusions from all of this, the continuation of culturally sanctioned sexual violence against women can be remedied only by gaining control of the social factors that are causally responsible. Because as you can see, there are all of these human rights provisions and even laws in India, probably in Egypt also, but the laws are not adequately enforced. So the steps that are needed is attempts to demolish the factors that constitute the rape culture. And the conclusion, all governments that have ratified the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, CEDAW, that's the Women's Convention, and other international human rights treaties have an obligation to respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of the many women in their countries who are sexually assaulted and bring the perpetrators to justice. So I'm sorry you can't see the last slides because there's a group of men who are supporting women and attempting in solidarity with women to halt the epidemic of sexual violence against women. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Muito obrigada.
So our second speaker this morning is Sauron Home, who again is an internationally renowned bioethicist. He works at the University of Manchester in the UK and also at the University of Oslo in Norway, but he's actually originally from Denmark. So he's an internationalist at heart and a practicing internationalist. So Sauron, welcome.
Well, I'm going to talk about something different. If you want to hear my provocative talk, you'll have to come to the very last session of the Congress, where I will give my provocative talk. This is the non-provocative talk. What obligations do I have towards my genetic family? This is what I will try to speak about. And I've been interested in this for many years for reasons that I will explain to you shortly. But the reason to give this particular talk now was that I was reading Hilde Lendmann's recent book, Holding and Letting Go, The Social Practice of Personal Identities, and from page 148, she asks us to consider two half-brothers, Ned and Sam, who have grown up without knowing about the existence of the other. Now, Ned now needs a bone marrow transplant. He becomes aware of Sam's existence. What are Sam's obligations? So we have two people here. They're genetically related, but perhaps not related in any other ways. Now, what Hilde claims, or at least what I read her as claiming, is, first of all, that it is intelligible that Sam should see Ned as his brother, and also intelligible that Ned could feel hurt if Sam declined to donate. Second, that Sam is part of Ned's family tree, and the connection between them is not simply biological. And thirdly, that our current practices show that genetic family ties matter socially. Now, I am perfectly willing to accept 1 and 3, both independently. I think they're true, and also jointly, because part of the reason that we find the responses and the beliefs in 1 to be intelligible is because they're produced by 3, that our current practices have this feature. What I will deny is any strong reading of 2. Now, I'm very interested in this because of my own family history. I'm a third-generation adopted child. I was adopted, my father was adopted, and my father's mother was adopted. I happen to know that I have at least 3 younger half-siblings, of whom the only thing I know is that they exist. Well, I hope they exist, or that they existed. So this is a sort of a personal interest to me. If I got a letter or an email from one of my half-siblings, would I have a greater obligation to answer it than if I got one from a stranger? And I think, yes, perhaps I would, but my argument here would be that even though I ought to answer the email, the answer could legitimately be that I think that we are strangers and that I want it to continue to be that way. Now, why is the question more generally important apart from my peculiar family history? Well, we have Ned and Sam-like situations where healthcare needs are at play, and we, through our practices of, and now this has changed itself, through our practices of assisted reproduction, we will create many more Ned and Sam-like situations. It's likely to become more common that there are unknown or almost unknown to me people who are genetically related. It's also likely to become more easy to find them than it is now. Now, there are at least 3 different but often overlapping kinds of family relations identified in the literature. There's the genetic family, there's the social family broadly, those that in a particular society is recognized as my family, and there's my affiliative family, those I think of as my family. And I think our pre-reflective views of family obligation track none of these family relations perfectly. It doesn't track genetic, it doesn't track social or affiliative families. And because these 3 family relations are different, it also means that, except for genetic family relations, being in a family tree is not transitive. I might be in your family tree, and you might not be in mine. And of course, there are many societies in which only certain kinds of genetic relations generate social obligations. So how do we identify our moral family? Those that we are linked to in a way that generates moral obligations that are different to the obligations we hold towards pure strangers. Now, Hilde in her book points out that if Sam is considering whether to help Ned and is tending towards the view that he has an obligation to help, it is not an adequate rebuttal of the obligation to say, but you're only genetically related to him. I think that is true. But on the other hand, if Sam is tending towards the view that he has no obligation, it is not an adequate rebuttal either to say, but you are genetically related to him. Now, the reason for this is, of course, that both of these rebuttals are actually begging the question. They are both implying that the issue of the importance of genetic relatedness is settled. So why might we think that genetic relatedness matter? Well, we could think that it's all about evolutionary psychology, that we are hardwired to prefer our kin because kin preference increases inclusive fitness. The problem with this argument is that inclusive fitness is not ethically important in itself. It is not really ethically important how many of my genes are spread to the next generation. The other problem is that by the same argument, we are probably also hardwired to display out-group aggressiveness and in-group preference, or what is otherwise known as racism, and many other problematic attitudes and dispositions. So the fact that we are hardwired in a particular way by an evolutionary past doesn't really tell us much about how we should act. Now, genetic relations may also make us especially suited to help. One of the reasons that Ned wants to contact Sam is obviously that there is a larger chance that Sam is a suitable donor because they're related in this way. Now, if we take that genetic relatedness makes us especially suited to help as a reason that we have obligations, this just shows that people who are more suited to help have stronger obligations, whether or not they're more suited due to genetic relatedness or some other factors. If instead of Ned and Sam, we think of Ted and Pam, Ted needs a donor, he searches available donor profiles, gene profiles on the web, and he finds that Pam is a good possible donor, despite the fact that they are not related. He contacts Pam. Does she have any obligations to help? And is that obligation different from Sam's? So I think, in the end, what we take to be our moral family is not a matter of genetic relatedness. It's a matter of in which genetic relatedness may play a part, but it's dependent on social facts, it's dependent on our specific family history. Now, genetics also, and the issue of genetic relatedness also plays a large part in our discussions about assisted reproductive technologies. Now, one of the reasons that this matter is clear that there are a lot of people who have strong preferences for genetic relatedness. They have a strong preference for the child that is being created, being related to them in a genetic way. Now, I think these preferences are perfectly intelligible. It is perfectly understandable why in our society you would feel that way. And it would continue to be perfectly understandable even if genetically relatedness does not really matter morally. The preferences might still matter. This still leaves the question of whether there's anything more of ethical importance in having a genetically related child than mere preference for this outcome. And let me again say that by introspection, I don't think that there's anything more. What makes my son, and what makes me willing to make significant sacrifices for him, if necessary, has very little to do with genetics and much more to do with social interaction. We share a history. 9 months before he was born is an important part of that history. The exact point at which he was conceived is a less important part, but he would be mine even if we did not share his conception and gestation. And of course, in my family, we talk about my grandparents, and we show him pictures of my grandparents, to which he has a relation, even though he does not have a genetic relation to any of them. Now, when we talk about genetic relation in relation to assisted reproduction, of course, we are not talking about children who are ours, who are not genetically related to us, and we don't know it. We are talking about cases where we know that they're not genetically related from the start. So why would we think that genetic relatedness matters in assisted reproduction? Well, we might think, again, that it's a hardwired desire, that simply as a matter of evolutionary fact, we are hardwired to want genetically related children. Now, that might mean that the preference or desire is difficult to get rid of, but of course, again, the fact that something is hardwired evolutionarily doesn't mean that it's rationally required. Then I think we have to distinguish it from a preference for gestation, birth, and early connection. Now, all of these preferences are also completely intelligible, but they are unrelated to genetics. Then we could think, well, the important thing here is that when we're having a genetically related child to assisted reproduction, it is a joint project of the couple. But then genetic relation to one parent seems to be good enough in many assisted reproduction contexts, so perhaps we can also disentangle joint from genetic. And finally, of course, we have social expectation. Now, this is already embedded in the English language. We speak about reproduction. We have ideas that what we are doing when we're having children is somehow reproducing either ourselves or the family name and line. But again, of course, this doesn't tend in any way to show that genetic relatedness is morally important, apart from the fact that we have this preference. So I think the most we can say for the desire to have children who are genetically related to us is that it's completely understandable and not irrational. Whether it's a morally good desire still needs to be shown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sauron. So I think we have time for some questions. I don't know whether there are roving mics that can go around. It's going to be difficult for me to see everybody, but does anybody have a question?
Good morning. Thank you for those great presentations. I would like to ask Professor Ruth Macklin regarding your presentation and the theme that you afford. What is the role that you consider has bioethics, perhaps in the advocate for the women's rights, or perhaps in sometimes, although there is an enormous cadre of declarations and conventions, I would like your insights regarding the role specifically of bioethics, if the advocate of the rights of women would be a good instance. Thanks.
It's a very good question, Dr. Malahmad, especially because we don't know how activist bioethics is or should be. Advocacy is one thing, and the form that advocacy takes can vary. So much of bioethics is essentially an intellectual and academic activity, but if bioethicists were to join with activists, not only for advocacy, but for example, a human rights approach can point out what the potential remedies or potential actions are, where bioethicists alone probably are insufficiently powered to do something, but if bioethicists were to join in an advocacy movement with others, activists, human rights lawyers, and for example, a group that I mentioned in Europe that tracks violence, sexual violence against women, then bioethicists would be working with others who have both perhaps more authority and more of an activist mode than most bioethicists.
This is a question for Sauron. Would it matter to any of your argument if the genetic relationship that hardwired us to care about those genetic relations more than we do other people? Or is the argument or the point you made about rational requirement somehow not applied to what we can and can't do?
I think that if it was the case that we were hardwired, sort of, that every time we recognized that someone was genetically related to us, our brain would sort of automatically say to us, you have stronger obligations towards this person than you have towards other persons. Then I think it would matter, but it would matter indirectly, because I think that the strength of our understandable and not irrational preferences tend to matter morally. Now, I think it's quite unlikely that evolution has managed that trick, because sort of, let me say that so far we don't know of examples of what I would call bare genetic relationness. Even in Hilde's example, these two men have the same biological father in a certain sense. Now, in the future, we could have bare genetic relatedness when we have artificial gametes, or if we have artificial gametes, because we would simply have a situation where these gametes had been produced in a lab and there was no human being who had produced them. And I think sort of it's quite unlikely that evolution would have managed to make that, sort of make my brain in a way so that that would matter to me, that I and someone else came out of the same lab.
Good morning, Anand Bhan from India. Thank you for those two very interesting presentations. Ruth, I had a thought about what you would think would be the requirement in terms of tackling masculinities. I think part of the problem has been, a lot of focus has been essentially on laws which protect women, but that doesn't really tackle the other aspect, which is the social construct of masculinities. And I think this is what health activists in countries like India have realized, that if we really want to tackle violence against women as an issue, then part of what we need to face is this social construct which masculinity brings in. And I think that's where I think a lot of work is now happening, working with young men, working with fathers, working with sometimes village elders in trying to change their perspective about how women should be treated. So do you have any thoughts about how you feel that should be addressed? And Sauron, when I was listening to your presentation, I was trying to transpose that into a global arena. I was trying to think if we can take those same arguments towards common ancestries which some of our nations have in South Asia, in Africa, in Latin America. What do you think would be some of the responsibilities you feel that all these nations, which often have culturally similar, have often been divided because of historical reasons, sometimes depending on who colonized them, but at the same time have very similar relationships as the way you were charting out in a genetic arena. Do you think there are similar responsibilities and similar questions? I would see those questions of arising in terms of pandemics across borders, in terms of sharing healthcare workers. Those questions arise, I think, in that sense, in global health as well. So if I could take you into that direction and ask you to give some thoughts on that.
Anand, if I heard your question rightly, we can talk both about social changes and changes within the family. So if you remember the slide when the equipment was working properly, the rape culture, all of those elements in the rape culture, or most of them, are social factors which, if social change is possible through advocacy and perhaps through even more than advocacy, but trying to bring to justice the perpetrators, then there have to be changes in the rape culture. Now, one of the things that's striking is what happens within the family. What the literature suggests is that mothers, I'm not sure what the role of fathers is, but that mothers tell their daughters not to dress provocatively. So the onus is on women not to distract men too much by wearing provocative clothing, with the assumption that men somehow can't help themselves when women wear short shorts or revealing clothing. But what do the mothers say to their sons? And this, it seems to me, is equally important, not trying to indicate to their daughters how they can avoid provoking men, but rather talking to their sons about their role as they're growing up and when they become men. So certainly within the family, I'm sure fathers have a role as well, but mothers being the nurturing one and the ones talking to their daughters, perhaps fathers ought to also talk to their sons.
Okay, you can't see the clock, but I can see the clock, which tells me that the session has ended. I think my brief answer to your very interesting question is that nothing in what I say sort of is was intended to deny the role of family. And I don't want to deny either that sort of that it can be perfectly rationally and morally acceptable for you to identify in a certain way, for instance, with your nation or with your language. But again, sort of the mere fact that you and I speak the same language, it's difficult for me to see that that should generate any moral obligation, or the mere fact that we happen to belong to the same nation. I think in the same way, it's difficult to see how that in itself could generate a particular moral obligation. I think what can generate the moral obligation is the history that we share. But exactly how that goes, I think, would take us too far.
Okay, thank you very much. Apologies to those who couldn't get to ask the questions, but we're short of time. We have a packed agenda. I'd just like you to join me in thanking our two speakers once again.